It was a cold winter morning when Ethan Matthews started his drive to the office. The sky was a pale gray, and a thin layer of frost covered the trees lining the road. He could see his breath fogging up the windshield as the heater struggled to warm the car. He had an important meeting scheduled with investors from overseas, and he needed to be sharp, as he always was. Time was ticking down, and he focused on the road as the minutes passed by. His thoughts were already consumed by the presentations he would need to make, and the decisions he would need to defend. His company's future was on the line, and Ethan Matthews wasn't about to let anything derail it. Not today, not on this of all days. As he turned onto a quiet street near the office, a sudden flash of red and blue lights broke the early morning silence. The familiar sound of sirens filled the air. His eyes flicked to the rearview mirror. His heart rate picked up just a little. It wasn't unusual to see police around this area, but Ethan had been careful not to speed or break any rules. This wasn't the kind of day he wanted to spend dealing with distractions. He pulled over to the side of the road and turned off the engine. The officers would be here in a moment, and whatever they wanted, he would take care of it quickly and move on. No time for trouble, just get the ticket and go back to business. Two officers approached his car, both wearing dark uniforms. Their faces were hard to read behind their sunglasses. Even though the weather was barely above freezing, Ethan felt an unexpected chill crawl up his spine as the officers stood by his window. The taller one knocked lightly on the glass and gestured for him to roll it down. Ethan did as asked and gave them a polite nod. Both officers stared at him without saying anything for a moment. The silence felt thick, almost heavy, as if they were weighing something in their minds. The shorter officer finally spoke with a sharp tone, asking if Ethan knew why he had been pulled over. Ethan looked at him, then glanced down at his speedometer, which read within the legal limit. There was nothing about his driving that warranted this stop, so he responded honestly, "I don't think so, officer. I've been driving carefully, just heading to a meeting." The taller officer cut him off before he could finish speaking. "You were going too fast back there," the shorter officer added, "and we're going to need to see some ID." Ethan's eyes narrowed slightly. This was odd, very odd. He handed over his driver's license without hesitation, though the skepticism lingered in his chest. But the officers didn't seem to be in any hurry to issue a simple ticket or move on. They looked over his ID, exchanged glances, and then seemed to make some sort of silent decision. Without saying anything, they opened the door and told him to step out of the car. Confused, but still trying to remain composed, Ethan complied. The cold air hit him hard, and he winced as the wind whipped through his coat. He hoped this was just some sort of misunderstanding that could be resolved quickly, but the officers had a different idea altogether. "Get on the ground," they said together, their voices almost in sync. Ethan felt his stomach drop. "What are you doing?" he asked, more out of disbelief than anger. But the officers weren't listening. They were too busy looking at each other, as if they were enjoying the power they held over him in that moment. "You heard us," they said again, and this time they didn't move until he got down on the ground. The cold bite of the pavement against his hands and knees was almost unbearable, but it wasn't the pain that stunned the most. It was the humiliation. The officers stood watching with a casual detachment as Ethan tried to make sense of what was happening. What had he done to deserve this? Why were they treating him like this? Ethan's hands shook slightly as he pressed them into the cold pavement, his mind racing. The icy surface cut through his thin gloves, sending sharp pangs of discomfort up his arms. He glanced up at the officers, expecting them to say something, anything that could explain why he was being treated like this. But there was nothing. The taller officer smirked slightly, arms crossed, while the shorter officer stood with his hands on his hips, both seemingly content with watching him struggle. "Come on," the shorter officer barked. "Let's see if you can do a few push-ups. Get moving." Ethan's brain stalled for a moment, disbelief filling his thoughts. Push-ups? In the freezing cold? Was this some sort of joke? He looked around, noticing that a few pedestrians had begun to slow down, their attention drawn to the bizarre scene. His pulse quickened as he realized the officers weren't going to back down. He had to comply, at least for now. "Listen," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. "I'm just trying to get to a meeting." "This is..." "No excuses," the taller officer interrupted. his tone cold and dismissive. "Get down and do them now, or things will get worse." Ethan hesitated, his pride burning in the pit of his stomach. His meeting, his career, everything that mattered to him, felt suddenly so distant. None of it seemed to matter as much as this ridiculous demand. But the officers weren't waiting for him to figure it out. They had made their point clear. He gritted his teeth and slowly lowered his chest to the ground. His fingers dug into the pavement, trying to steady himself against the biting cold that seeped through his clothes. "One," the shorter officer called out as Ethan pushed himself back up. "Keep going." Ethan could feel the crowd growing around him, some murmuring among themselves, others recording the entire thing on their phones. The pressure of being watched made it even harder to breathe. His face flushed with embarrassment, and the physical strain. Each push-up felt like it took everything out of him. His body ached with the cold, and his arms trembled as he pushed against the frozen ground again and again. But still, the officers stood above him, unmoving, as though enjoying the spectacle. "Faster," the taller officer commanded. Ethan pushed harder, his arms burning, his breath ragged. He could feel the sting in his joints, the cold creeping in deeper. His mind screamed for him to stop, but he refused to let them see him break. No matter how absurd this was, no matter how much it hurt, he refused to give them the satisfaction of seeing him crumble. The crowd grew, murmurs of disbelief filling the air. Some were sympathetic, others laughed. But the officers seemed unaffected by the rising tension. They were enjoying this, Ethan realized. They were relishing in their power, testing just how far they could push him before he cracked. And yet, no matter how much it stung, no matter how hard he had to fight to keep going, Ethan refused to give them what they wanted. He couldn't show weakness. Not now. "How many more?" Ethan gasped, his chest tightening, his arms threatening to give out. "Keep going," the shorter officer ordered coldly. "You'll stop when we say so." The air seemed to grow colder with each push-up, and the world around him felt distant, blurry. His breath came in short, painful bursts. The officers, the crowd, the harsh winter morning, all of it became a blur as Ethan's world narrowed down to one thing: the next push-up, the next breath. He couldn't think about what came after this, or the meeting he was missing. All that mattered was finishing, holding on to whatever shred of dignity he had left. But with every movement, a question lingered in his mind. Why was he allowing this? Why was he, a successful businessman who had worked his entire life to build a reputation, being reduced to this? The thought burned inside him, but he pushed it away, focusing on the task at hand. Then, finally, after what felt like an eternity, the officers stopped him. "That's enough," the taller officer said. "You're done." Ethan collapsed to the ground, his body sore, cold, and exhausted. He barely had the strength to stand, but he forced himself to his feet. His heart pounded, his breath ragged, and his mind raced with questions and emotions he couldn't begin to process. What just happened? What had he just been through? He looked up at the officers, trying to find the words to protest, to demand an explanation. But before he could speak, they were already walking away, their job done, leaving him in the cold with nothing but the echoes of their taunts. The crowd began to disperse, some still muttering, others leaving without a word. Ethan stood there for a moment, staring after them. His body ached, but it was the sting of humiliation, of helplessness, that cut the deepest. He wanted to scream, to confront them, but something inside him told him it wasn't over yet. Not by a long shot. This wasn't how it was going to end. Ethan Matthews wasn't going to let this slide. As Ethan stood there, shivering in the aftermath of the humiliating ordeal, his mind was a whirlwind of confusion, anger, and disbelief. The officers had already driven off, leaving him alone on the side of the road. The crowd had mostly dispersed as well, some of them mumbling in disbelief, others offering sympathetic glances, but none of them had come forward to intervene. They had all seen it, his public humiliation, and yet it felt as if everyone had simply gone on with their lives. Ethan's legs felt weak beneath him, and he took a moment to steady himself. The cold air bit through his clothes, and he could feel the frost creeping into his bones. He looked down at his hands, still red and raw from pushing himself into the frozen pavement. His chest tightened as the realization began to sink in. Asterisk. This wasn't just a bad experience. It was an attack on his dignity. Asterisk. As he made his way back to his car, the reality of what had happened started to hit harder. The drive to his office felt long, each second stretching out as his mind replayed the events over and over again. The officers' taunts, the mocking tone in their voices, and the smug way they watched him struggle. It wasn't just an isolated incident. It was something bigger. The feeling of powerlessness that gnawed at him had nothing to do with the push-ups themselves, and everything to do with the abuse of authority, the way they had treated him like an object for their amusement. The more he thought about it, the angrier he became. As he arrived at the office, his assistant Lisa was already waiting outside, pacing nervously. When she saw him pull up, her face immediately fell. "Ethan, what happened? I saw everything from across the street. I'm so sorry." Ethan didn't even answer at first. He just stood there, trying to shake off the fog of the encounter. Lisa's words brought him back to reality. No one should ever have to go through that. "I'm calling the local news. We need to get this out there. People need to know what happened." He shook his head, still feeling the sting of the experience. "It's not just about me, Lisa. This goes beyond me. It's about what they think they can get away with, what they think they can do to anyone who crosses their path. What if I wasn't just some guy on his way to a meeting? What if it was someone else, someone who couldn't fight back?" Lisa nodded solemnly, understanding the gravity of what he was saying. "We need to take action. You can't just let them get away with this. It's not right." Ethan took a deep breath and finally spoke, his voice steadier now. "You're right. I won't let it slide. Not after what I just went through, and not after seeing what this means for anyone else who might end up in the same position." In the next few hours, as Ethan gathered himself, Lisa worked behind the scenes to contact a journalist from a local newspaper. She provided them with the video footage of the incident, footage that had already started to circulate on social media, much to the officers' discomfort. The more Ethan thought about what had happened, the clearer it became that he wasn't just dealing with a couple of rogue cops. This was part of a broader pattern. He had seen signs of police misconduct in the town before, whispers of it here and there, but today it had become personal. He couldn't let it go, not now that he knew how it felt to be on the receiving end of that kind of power. By the time the afternoon rolled around, the story had already started to make waves. The video, now shared across social media platforms, had sparked outrage. People were furious, not just because of the humiliation Ethan endured, but because they recognized the abuse of power for what it was. The story was picked up by the local news, and interviews with witnesses began to paint a disturbing picture of what had transpired. The two officers who had forced Ethan to perform push-ups had become a symbol of everything that was wrong with the system. Ethan, in the meantime, stayed out of the limelight as much as possible. His phone rang off the hook with media requests, but he ignored most of them, preferring to focus on the next step. It wasn't just about making headlines or seeking revenge. It was about making sure this kind of thing didn't happen to anyone else. The more he thought about it, the more determined he became. He couldn't undo the humiliation he'd faced, but he could make sure the officers who had done this would face consequences. The wheels of change had started turning, and Ethan knew that he wouldn't rest until they had gone full circle. What had begun as an embarrassing moment in the freezing cold was quickly becoming a movement for accountability and justice in the small town. Ethan spent the next few hours in his office, his thoughts still consumed by the incident. His mind raced through the possibilities, each one a mix of frustration and determination. He knew that the public outrage was only the beginning, but he also understood that this would be a long and difficult fight. The officers who had humiliated him were part of a system that often protected its own, no matter how wrong they were. If he was going to make a real change, he would need more than just public support. He needed to take action. Lisa was his first ally, and she wasted no time in helping him mobilize. She had already reached out to a local journalist, and soon, the story was being reported by every major news outlet in the city. Videos of the incident were being shared online by thousands of people, and Ethan's name was on the lips of every newscaster. The public outrage was palpable. But even as the support poured in, Ethan knew this wasn't the moment for him to bask in the attention. This was only the beginning. By the evening, the police department had issued a statement in response to the growing controversy. They said they were aware of the incident, and that an internal investigation would be conducted. Ethan knew that words were meaningless if no real change came from this. He couldn't allow this to be swept under the rug like so many cases before. The department might promise an investigation, but would it really lead to anything substantial? Ethan didn't believe it would unless he pushed harder. The next morning, as the sun rose over the city, Ethan put his plan into action. He called a lawyer, someone who specialized in civil rights cases, and explained everything that had happened. The lawyer was immediately interested in taking on the case, seeing the potential for both a legal victory and a much-needed reform in the local police department. But Ethan knew that a legal battle could take months, even years, and he couldn't afford to wait that long. He needed to hit them where it would hurt most, in the court of public opinion. At the same time, Lisa worked tirelessly behind the scenes to gather statements from witnesses. She tracked down the people who had filmed the incident, some of whom had shared their footage on social media, and encouraged them to provide official testimonies. Ethan's case was quickly becoming a cause caliber, but it was one he was determined to see through to the end. Later that afternoon, Ethan received a call from the police chief's office. It was clear that they were scrambling, trying to contain the fallout from the viral video. The police chief, a man Ethan had met on a few occasions in the past, wanted to arrange a meeting. Ethan didn't hesitate. "I'll meet with you," Ethan said, his voice steady but firm. "But know this, I'm not interested in hearing excuses. I want to see action, real accountability." The meeting was set for the following morning. As Ethan prepared for the meeting, his emotions shifted from anger to something more focused: determination. This wasn't just about punishing the officers who had humiliated him. It was about ensuring that what happened to him wouldn't happen to anyone else. He thought about the countless people who had been mistreated by the very system that was supposed to protect them, people who couldn't afford to fight back or make their voices heard. Ethan understood now, more than ever, that this was his moment to stand up, not just for himself, but for anyone who had been wronged in the same way. He wasn't just fighting for a personal grievance. He was fighting for justice. The next day, he walked into the police department, head held high, ready for whatever came next. He wasn't just another businessman in a suit. He was someone with a voice, a platform, and the will to make a difference. Inside the police chief's office, Ethan sat across from the man who was supposed to be in charge of ensuring justice was served. The chief's face was tense, but he greeted Ethan politely. He knew that this meeting was inevitable, but it was clear that he was already on the defensive. "Mr. Matthews," the police chief began, "I want to apologize for what happened. We're taking this situation very seriously, and I assure you that a thorough investigation is underway." Ethan didn't waste any time. Apologies aren't enough. I've seen too many cases where apologies don't lead to real change. What I want to know is how you plan to make sure something like this never happens again. The chief shifted uncomfortably, clearly unprepared for Ethan's directness. Ethan's mind raced as he listened to the chief's vague promises, but he could already tell that the man was more interested in damage control than in true accountability. Ethan wasn't going to let him off the hook that easily. "We're committed to making sure this doesn't happen again," the chief said, but Ethan wasn't convinced. He knew that words were meaningless. It was action that mattered. "I'll believe it when I see it," Ethan said. "I'm not going away, and I'm not going to let you sweep this under the rug." The meeting with the police chief left Ethan feeling unsettled. He had hoped for more, but what he got was a lot of empty promises and evasive answers. The chief had tried to assure him that everything was being handled, but Ethan knew better. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about sending a message that the abuse of power would no longer be tolerated. He couldn't let the officers walk away from this, and he certainly couldn't let the department sweep it under the rug. The stakes were too high. That evening, as Ethan returned to his office, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. His phone had been buzzing with messages, support from friends, colleagues, and strangers alike. Many of them had seen the video and were outraged by what had happened. A few even offered their assistance in any way they could. The public sentiment was growing in his favor, but Ethan knew that public opinion, no matter how powerful, could only get him so far. He needed action. Lisa, ever the efficient ally, had already begun reaching out to local activists and community leaders who were known for their advocacy in police reform. She was putting together a press conference for the following week, one that would bring together voices from across the community to stand in solidarity with Ethan. It was clear that the situation was turning into something much larger than just a case of police misconduct. It was becoming a movement, and Ethan was at the center of it. The next few days were a blur of phone calls, meetings, and media interviews. Ethan gave his first public statement, addressing the press with a mix of calm resolve and impassioned anger. He spoke about his personal experience, but he also talked about the bigger picture, the systemic issues that allowed this kind of behavior to flourish unchecked. It wasn't just about one officer or one incident. It was about a culture that enabled abuse of power and allowed those in positions of authority to act without accountability. The press conference was scheduled for Thursday morning, and by the time it arrived, the anticipation was palpable. The local news stations were all in attendance, and even a few national outlets had picked up the story. Ethan stood at the podium, flanked by community leaders, lawyers, and activists who had rallied behind his cause. His heart raced as he looked out at the crowd, but he was no longer afraid. This was his moment to speak for the countless others who had suffered in silence. Before he spoke, Lisa leaned in and whispered, "You've got this, Ethan. Just stay true to what you believe." He nodded, taking a deep breath as he approached the microphone. The room fell silent. "Thank you all for being here today," Ethan began, his voice steady and clear. "I stand before you today, not just as a man who was wronged by a few individuals, but as someone who believes in justice. What happened to me wasn't just an isolated incident. It's part of a much larger problem. A problem that exists not only here, but across the country. The abuse of power by those who are supposed to protect us must end. We cannot allow people to use their authority to humiliate, degrade, and abuse others without facing consequences." Ethan's words were met with murmurs of agreement from the crowd, and he could see the fire in their eyes. They weren't just there for him. They were there because they too had witnessed or experienced the consequences of unchecked authority. They were ready for change. "Today, I'm calling for transparency," Ethan continued. "I'm calling for accountability. I'm calling for real reform in how our police officers are trained, monitored, and held responsible for their actions. I will not stop until we see justice, not just for me, but for everyone who has been subjected to this kind of treatment." He paused, letting his words hang in the air, before adding, "I've already spoken to the lawyer who is representing me, and we are taking legal action. But this is bigger than one case. It's about a movement for justice, for the future, for every person who has ever been silenced by fear." The room erupted into applause, the sound deafening. It was the kind of response Ethan had hoped for, but it was more than that. It was the beginning of something much larger. The movement had already begun, and it was clear that the police department would have to reckon with it. Ethan wasn't just a man seeking retribution. He had become the face of a call for change, and there was no turning back now. In the days that followed, the public support only grew. Protesters gathered outside the police department, demanding action. Activists organized rallies, and local politicians began to take notice. The mayor, who had previously remained silent on the issue, called for an independent investigation into the incident. For the first time in what felt like ages, there was a real chance for change. But Ethan knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. There would be resistance. There would be obstacles. But for the first time since that cold morning when he was forced to do push-ups in the street, he felt a sense of hope. He wasn't alone. And together, they could make sure that no one would have to go through what he had endured. The days following the press conference were a whirlwind of activity. Ethan could barely keep up with the overwhelming support and media attention. Calls from local politicians, media outlets, and even national news organizations flooded his phone. But the most surprising calls came from former officers, some who had long since left the force and others who were still serving. They reached out to share their own stories of corruption and misconduct within the department, providing Ethan with insider knowledge that he hadn't expected. One of these former officers, Mike Reynolds, contacted him through a private email. He had been a police officer for over a decade before leaving the force under pressure, citing ethical conflicts with the department's culture. In his message, he described the pervasive atmosphere of impunity that allowed officers to act outside the law without fear of consequences. "Ethan, what you're doing is bigger than you know," Mike wrote. "There are so many people within that department who feel trapped. They want to do the right thing, but they're afraid. Keep pushing, and we'll help however we can." Mike's message came as a revelation. Ethan had suspected that the incident with the two officers was part of a larger issue, but hearing from someone who had been inside the system confirmed his worst fears. This wasn't just about the two officers who had humiliated him. It was a symptom of a much deeper problem that needed to be addressed. With this new information in hand, Ethan knew he needed to take the next step. He called a meeting with his lawyer, Lisa, and a few trusted community leaders who had been helping him throughout the ordeal. Together, they began to strategize a course of action that could force real change within the police department. The idea of filing a lawsuit was still on the table, but they knew that it wasn't enough on its own. They needed to push for an independent oversight committee to review the department's practices and hold officers accountable for their actions. In the days that followed, Ethan worked with local politicians to draft a proposal for reform. The proposal called for increased transparency, the establishment of an independent review board, and comprehensive reforms in officer training. He was determined to make sure that the events he had experienced wouldn't be forgotten once the media frenzy died down. But the push for reform wasn't without its opposition. As Ethan's movement gained traction, so did the resistance. Several high-ranking officers in the department, including the police chief, began to fight back against the growing calls for accountability. They publicly criticized Ethan, accusing him of using the incident for personal gain and fueling anti-police sentiment. They even suggested that Ethan was exaggerating the details of the incident, hoping to discredit him and turn public opinion against him. The tactics didn't stop there. Rumors began to spread, some claiming that Ethan had a history of confrontations with law enforcement, others that he was part of a larger conspiracy to dismantle the department. These attacks were predictable, but they stung nonetheless. Ethan was no stranger to public scrutiny, but this was different. These were the same people who had protected the officers who wronged him, and now they were using their influence to undermine his credibility. But instead of backing down, Ethan used the backlash to fuel his resolve. He refused to let the smear campaign intimidate him or distract from the larger goal. He knew that the harder the resistance fought, the more it proved that the system needed to change. The pressure was mounting, but Ethan had already come too far to turn back. He continued to push forward, meeting with community leaders, organizing protests, and speaking out on social media. The more he spoke, the more people came forward with their own stories of mistreatment by law enforcement, stories that had been buried under layers of silence and fear. It became clear that this wasn't just one man's fight. It was the fight of an entire community that had been silenced for too long. By the end of the week, Ethan received a call from a prominent civil rights attorney who had been following his story closely. The attorney, who had successfully litigated several high-profile police misconduct cases, offered his expertise in helping Ethan build a legal case that could bring national attention to the issue of police reform. "I've been watching everything unfold," the attorney said. "You've got the momentum, and now it's time to use it. We can make a real difference here, Ethan. Let's turn this into a movement that can't be ignored." Ethan felt a renewed sense of hope. With the support of the community, the legal backing, and the growing movement for police accountability, he knew they were on the verge of something big. The fight was far from over, but it had taken on a life of its own. The next chapter would be one of legal battles, public pressure, and pushing for real systemic change. Ethan had become more than just a man seeking justice for a personal wrong. He had become the face of a movement that had the potential to change the way law enforcement operated in his town and perhaps across the nation. The road ahead would be long and difficult, but for the first time since that freezing morning, Ethan was confident that change was within reach. As the weeks passed, the pressure on the police department intensified. Ethan's movement had sparked something far beyond a simple call for justice. It had ignited a fire for systemic change. The public's outrage had only grown, fueled by the continued support from activists, local politicians, and concerned citizens who rallied behind Ethan's cause. The police department, once confident it could weather the storm, began to feel the weight of scrutiny from all sides. Ethan had spent countless hours meeting with activists, civil rights groups, and even national news outlets. He'd spoken on television, appeared at rallies, and used every opportunity to make sure the momentum didn't fade. But what had once been a personal fight was now bigger than any one individual. This was about creating a platform where the voices of those who had been mistreated by law enforcement could finally be heard. The more people spoke out, the more undeniable the issue became. What had happened to him was not an isolated incident. It was a pattern. The media frenzy surrounding the case had reached a fever pitch, and Ethan's phone seemed to never stop ringing. He'd become a symbol of resistance against police misconduct, a symbol of someone who dared to stand up and say enough. But as the story gained national traction, the pressure on Ethan also increased. The attacks against him grew more personal and vindictive. One evening, as Ethan sat at his desk, he saw a new wave of online criticism. Posts flooded social media, accusing him of exaggerating the events, painting the officers as villains without justification, and even accusing him of using the situation for self-promotion. He felt a sting each time he saw a post questioning his character. The negative comments were more than just trolls. They were coming from individuals who seemed to know too much about his personal life. He even received a few threats, vague but ominous, suggesting that this wasn't just about the officers anymore. Despite it all, Ethan refused to back down. The attacks only strengthened his resolve. If anything, they showed him just how desperate the opposition had become. They were fighting to protect a system that had allowed their power to go unchecked for too long. Ethan knew that the more they tried to silence him, the more their own actions would be exposed. The world was watching, and he wouldn't let them make him disappear into the background. One morning, a breakthrough came when a whistleblower from within the police department reached out to Ethan. The officer, who had worked in the department for years but had grown disillusioned with the culture of corruption, had risked his career to pass along confidential documents. These documents revealed that the two officers who had humiliated Ethan were not only involved in multiple prior instances of misconduct, but had also been protected by the higher-ups in the department. The department's internal review board had routinely ignored complaints against them, ensuring they continued to act with impunity. Ethan knew this was the key to taking down the corrupt system. With the evidence in hand, he shared the documents with his lawyer, who immediately recognized the importance of the information. Together, they began crafting a legal strategy that would not only seek justice for Ethan, but also expose the department's cover-up of repeated misconduct. It was a game-changer, a direct hit to the heart of the system that had allowed these abuses to happen time and time again. Meanwhile, the protests in the streets only grew larger. Activists, fueled by the documents and the growing scandal, began to demand not only accountability for Ethan's case, but a complete overhaul of the department. Signs reading "Justice for Ethan" and "End Police Corruption" became common at rallies across the city. The pressure on the police chief and his officers intensified, and local politicians, who had previously been hesitant to take sides, now began to publicly call for an independent investigation into the department's practices. Ethan knew that this was the turning point. They had the evidence, the public support, and the legal backing. It was time to push for real change. But the road ahead wouldn't be easy. The department wouldn't go down without a fight, and Ethan understood that they would pull out all the stops to protect themselves. The next few days were a blur of meetings, court filings, and public speeches. Ethan continued to speak out, determined to keep the issue front and center. The world was paying attention now. His voice had become a beacon of hope for those who had been ignored for far too long. And yet, as Ethan watched the situation unfold, he couldn't shake the feeling that the battle was just beginning. What had started as one man's fight against a humiliating experience had now evolved into a war for justice, a war that would demand not only the heads of the officers responsible, but the dismantling of an entire system of corruption. Ethan knew that his path would be filled with challenges, but he was no longer afraid. This was bigger than any personal grievance. It was about building a future where no one would ever have to endure what he had. The battle had reached its boiling point. Ethan stood at the center of a storm that was about to engulf the entire police department. With the whistleblower's documents in hand, the support of the public, and mounting pressure from activists, there was no way the department could continue to deny the systemic corruption within its ranks. But even as Ethan felt the surge of momentum, he knew that the hardest part was yet to come. The police chief, who had tried to minimize the situation for weeks, finally found himself cornered. The scandal was no longer just about Ethan's humiliating experience. It had grown into a full-fledged crisis. The department could no longer pretend that the abuse of power was an isolated incident. The weight of public opinion was too much to ignore, and behind closed doors, the chief and his officers were scrambling to contain the fallout. Ethan had already planned his next move. With the documents from the whistleblower, he and his lawyer filed an official lawsuit against the department, naming the two officers involved and seeking damages for the suffering caused, as well as a full investigation into the department's practices. The legal action was a calculated move, a way to force the department to face the truth under the pressure of a courtroom. But it wasn't just about the lawsuit. It was about ensuring the conversation didn't die down, that it kept burning until change was inevitable. Meanwhile, the protests in the streets had reached unprecedented levels. The support from the community was overwhelming, and Ethan found himself being approached by individuals from all walks of life. People who had suffered under the same system of abuse came forward, sharing their own stories of mistreatment at the hands of law enforcement. It became clear that Ethan's story was no longer just his. It was the story of a city, of a community, of a nation that had been silently bearing the weight of institutionalized injustice. On the day the lawsuit was officially filed, Ethan attended a press conference where he stood alongside his lawyer, Lisa, and several civil rights leaders. The room was packed with reporters, cameras flashing as they waited for him to speak. As Ethan approached the podium, his heart raced, but he felt a calm determination wash over him. This was the moment that could change everything. He cleared his throat and began, "Today, we take the first step toward true accountability. This lawsuit isn't just about me. It's about every person who has ever felt powerless, every person who has ever been mistreated by those who were supposed to protect them. It's about dismantling a system that has allowed the abuse of power to go unchecked for too long." He paused, letting the gravity of his words sink in before continuing. "The officers who humiliated me on that cold morning may have thought they were above the law, but today we show them that no one is above the law. The corruption that festers in this department cannot go unchallenged. We will not rest until those responsible are held accountable, and until real change is made in how law enforcement operates in this city." The crowd erupted into applause, and Ethan felt a surge of hope. This wasn't just a fight for justice anymore. It was a movement that had the power to reshape the system. The lawsuit was just the beginning, and he knew it wouldn't be an easy road. But for the first time, he believed that change was possible. As the legal battle unfolded, the media attention continued to grow. National networks picked up the story, and it quickly became a symbol of the fight for police reform across the country. The pressure on the police department was unbearable. The chief, facing a complete loss of public trust, was forced to step down amid the scandal, and other high-ranking officers were put under investigation. The pressure to reform the department grew with each passing day. Ethan's phone rang constantly, filled with messages of support, but also new threats and intimidation attempts. The police may have tried to intimidate him, but it was too late. He had become the face of a movement, one that would not be silenced, no matter how hard they tried. In the months that followed, Ethan continued his fight, never wavering. The lawsuit eventually led to a landmark settlement that not only awarded damages to Ethan, but also forced the city to adopt sweeping reforms. The department was overhauled, and an independent oversight committee was established to ensure accountability. The officers who had been involved in his humiliation were fired, and others were held accountable for their role in enabling misconduct. Ethan's life had changed in ways he could never have imagined. He had been forced into the fight by an act of cruelty, but in the end, he emerged as the leader of a movement that had redefined the relationship between law enforcement and the community. He had turned his pain into purpose, his humiliation into a catalyst for reform. And as he stood before the media one last time, speaking about the victory they had achieved, Ethan couldn't help but feel a sense of accomplishment. He had done it. He had stood up, not just for himself, but for an entire community. The fight for justice was far from over, but Ethan had shown the world that no one was untouchable, not even those in power.